Have you ever walked into a room and suddenly realized that the people leading you seem to stand not just taller in height, but taller in certainty, routine, and the effortless flow of their world, almost as if their schedules and stature were designed to fit perfectly into the spaces they occupy? And today, we're diving into why that sense of seamlessness feels so familiar, so polished, and so strangely comfortable to them compared to everyone else. So stay right here, settle in, and make sure you hit that subscribe button because this breakdown will reveal how expectations, presence, and privilege stack together in ways most people never even notice until they step back and look at the whole structure with fresh clarity. 1. The height advantage. The first point dives into the subtle psychological power that tallness holds in professional spaces. It explores how physical stature triggers authority biases without anyone saying a word. It highlights how executives benefit from instant credibility before demonstrating competence. It examines how height turns into a silent filter for leadership selection. It reflects on how shorter individuals must work harder for equal recognition. It shows how meetings shift energy toward taller figures. It analyzes how posture amplifies or minimizes presence. It reveals how body language intertwines with perception. It explains how cultural interpretations further shape reactions. It shows how height influences expectations of confidence. 2. The illusion of effortless scheduling. This point explores why executive schedules look perfect from the outside. It explains how behind-the-scenes support teams handle micro-chaos for them. It reveals how assistants absorb disruptions before executives notice them. It breaks down how external organization becomes internal identity. It shows how privilege masquerades as discipline. It examines how time protection shapes productivity perceptions. It highlights how others' labor creates their sense of ease. It uncovers how routine becomes cultural currency. It reveals how management buffers soften daily stress. It explains how their efficiency is partially engineered. It questions how fairness differs across roles. 3. Familiarity as workplace comfort. This point unpacks why certain executives feel at home in corporate culture. It explains how the norms match their upbringing and expectations. It shows how workplace tone mirrors their social experiences. It demonstrates how communication styles favor their background. It reveals how humor, references, and rhythms match theirs. It highlights how they rarely experience cultural friction. It describes how alignment creates emotional ease. It exposes how belonging affects confidence and authority. It examines how exclusion works subtly for others. It shows how comfort translates into stronger presence. It shows how systems unconsciously lift those who fit the mold. 4. Privilege hidden as professionalism. This point explores how advantages appear as personal traits. It describes how confidence is nurtured, not innate. It reveals how upbringing shapes composure under pressure. It questions how professionalism is defined through one group's standards. It shows how deviations are seen as unprofessional for others. It explains how certain behaviors are validated automatically. It uncovers how mistakes are forgiven more generously. It examines how polish is expected from some but granted to others. It highlights how bias shapes feedback and evaluation. It shows how presentation becomes tied to identity. It explores how expectations shift depending on who performs. 5. The aura of effortless authority. This point breaks down how authority feels natural for some executives. It explains how confidence is reinforced socially over time. It shows how leadership qualities get rewarded early in life. It reveals how privilege allows safer experimentation. It explores how failure carries lower personal risk. It examines how reassurance from others builds certainty. It dissects how networks validate authority continuously. It highlights how authority becomes performed smoothly. It questions how leadership is culturally framed. It reveals how tone, stance, and pacing affect perception. It shows how authority is rehearsed through opportunity. 6. Cultural rhythm alignment. This point unpacks why certain executives feel synced with workplace rhythm. It explains how their communication speed matches corporate norms. It reveals how pauses, tone, and assertiveness align with expectations. It explores how meetings feel comfortable instead of stressful. It breaks down how cadence becomes a source of security. It shows how rhythm affects perceived competence. It reveals how misalignment impacts evaluations unfairly. It highlights how matching the rhythm feels like home. It shows how familiarity boosts clarity and confidence. It examines how shared rhythm strengthens team trust. It uncovers how leadership styles fit existing patterns. 7. The structural cushion effect. This point explains how systems protect executives from instability. It explores how layers of support reduce pressure. It reveals how decision-making becomes safer with buffers. It shows how mistakes are absorbed by the system. It highlights how insulation builds composure. It questions how accountability differs across ranks. It examines how psychological safety fosters confidence. It explains how others carry unseen burdens. It breaks down how support creates emotional calm. It reveals how stress distribution is unequal. It shows how the system guards their reputation. It explains how this creates sustained ease. It reveals how protection shapes long-term behavior. 8. The seamless home feeling. This point explores how work feels like home for some executives. It describes how familiarity lowers emotional friction. It shows how similarity reduces misunderstandings. It explains how systems mirror their personal environments. It reveals how expectations match their upbringing. It recounts how comfort translates into smooth performance. It uncovers how others must adapt constantly. It highlights how home-like comfort enhances clarity. It shows how belonging shapes interpretations. It reflects on how identity fits into structure. It explores how ease affects decision-making. It questions how comfort influences fairness. 9. Expectation scaling. This point analyzes how expectations expand differently for executives. It explains how they're assumed capable before proving anything. It reveals how high expectations increase visibility. It explores how expectations turn into self-fulfilling outcomes. It examines how others face doubt before recognition. It shows how expectation creates upward momentum. It breaks down how higher trust leads to bigger roles. It describes how support follows perception. It reveals how expectations shape leadership paths. It analyzes how favor influences development pace. It questions how expectations create inequality. It shows how some rise faster due to perception. 10. The heightened to height cycle. This final point explains how expectation and height reinforce each other. It reveals how perception multiplies physical presence. It shows how stature amplifies credibility unfairly. It uncovers how expectation shapes opportunity flow. It examines how support builds on initial assumptions. It explains how privilege turns into performance. It breaks down how performance boosts reputation. It shows how reputation leads to more access. It reveals how access multiplies advantage. It illustrates how culture validates the cycle. It explores how normalized it becomes over time. It questions how fairness disappears in the process. It shows how height becomes symbolic of structure. And as we wrap up this deep look into how heightened expectations transform into actual heights that shape presence, interpretation, and comfort for certain executives, remember that understanding these structures isn't about blame but about clarity, because clarity lets you navigate, adapt, and rise without being tricked by illusions of ease or narratives built on invisible support systems. And if this breakdown opened your perspective even a little, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another insight that helps you see power, culture, and workplaces with sharper awareness, and stay connected, because the more we understand how these systems operate,